Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the virtual Lubar Center. I'm Mike Gousha, and today we are releasing our latest national survey of public attitudes toward the U.S. Supreme Court. Joining us today is the poll director here at Marquette Law School, Professor Charles Franklin. And Charles, I thought it might be helpful for people today to have a brief overview of our Supreme Court polling project, its origins, and what we're doing on a regular basis.
Thank you, Mike. It's good to be back again. Yes, we are doing something a little bit different from what we've done for the last 8 years or so. We're now doing polling on a national basis. Every 2 months, we conduct a national poll of adults in the U.S., and we devote most of these surveys to questions about the U.S. Supreme Court and the issues surrounding the court. On the other hand, we also have some room in the questionnaire for other national issues. And so we do ask about some things beyond the court. Today's release, though, is going to focus on the Supreme Court questions, while the items on national issues will be released tomorrow.
Charles, let's talk about the sample size. How many people did we talk to, the margin of error, and the kind of poll this is. It is an online poll, correct?
It is. What we're doing is using what has become increasingly a standard in national polls in particular, an online sample that is recruited through the U.S. Postal Service. We send invitations to a random sample of addresses in the country, inviting people to take part in these surveys. And from that, a national probability sample is recruited to complete the surveys online. But these are not volunteer online polls when just anybody can do the survey. You only can do these surveys if you are sampled from your address and invited and agree to participate in polls. These polls are conducted by the survey company SSRS in Pennsylvania, and they recruit the people into these panels and then conduct the surveys on our behalf, as well as on behalf of other survey organizations. For this particular survey, we were in the field September 7th through the 16th. We interviewed 1,411 adults 18 and over. And we have a margin of error this time of plus or minus 3.4 percentage points. We usually mention the party composition of our state samples. We'll mention it here for the national sample as well. It's 27% Republican, 42% independent, and 30% Democratic. If you take people who say they lean to one party or another, then it's 39 Republican, 18 independent, and 43 Democratic.
All right, Charles, let's go right to the headlines from this poll. And there is a headline. There's something that we see in this poll that we have not seen as much in past polls, and that is that the public's approval of the Supreme Court is down, and it's down in a fairly dramatic way.
It is. In this survey in September, 49% approve of the job the court's doing, but 50% disapprove. In July, just 2 months ago, 60% approved and 39% disapproved. And if we go back a year ago to September in our national survey, then September of 2020, it was 66 approve, 33 disapprove. So we saw a bit of a decline, but not a major one over the September of 2020 to July of this year, but now a pretty substantial 11-point drop in approval since July using our survey. And that is quite a change. The court has, in other polling as well as ours, often had a pretty high approval rating, and one that has seemed pretty stable from survey to survey. But we're seeing quite a bit of change over this course of the last 2 months.
In the last 2 months, Charles, have we seen significant movement among independents and among Democrats?
Right. There is a change. And with independents, it's 51 approve, 48 disapprove now. But they were at 61-37 in July. Democrats have also dropped. They were at 59 approval in July and have fallen to 37 and 62 disapprove now. In contrast, Republicans are up just a little bit, now 61-38, and in July, 57-42. What we saw over the previous year was that Republican approval actually came down from September of 2020 to July, and now is up a little bit, 4 more points. Democrats had not changed much over the previous year since September using the July poll, but have now dropped quite a bit over this last month or so, 2 months.
Charles, we can speculate until the cows come home, but I am going to ask you that because that will be the logical question you'll get from reporters out there saying, well, what do you think is at play? What was at play for the Republicans from year to year? What was in play in the last 2 months for Democrats and independents?
I think there are at least 2 things that are at work here. One is it was surprising in July when we saw that approval by Republicans had fallen quite a bit. I think that was despite the fact that President Trump appointed a new justice to the court, creating a 6-3 majority of justices appointed by Republican presidents. You would have thought that Republicans would be more happy with that. Then in this July to September period this year, the court issued several pretty substantial rulings, 2 going against Biden administration initiatives, and then just before we went in the field for the survey, issued a ruling allowing the Texas law that bans abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy, allowed that to go into effect. This produced a lot of coverage of the court, especially that last issue, just as we went into the field. I think if you look over the 2021 court term, which was from last October until the start of this October, the court issued a number of rulings where you actually had fairly large majorities, not just a pure liberal versus conservative split. Now, right at the end, they produced a few rulings that were more controversial, but those were all done before our July survey. I think what has happened in the time since then is whatever people might have seen as moderation on the court over the past year was followed by these 3 rulings right in a row and close together that all took a conservative tilt, if you will, certainly ruling against the Biden administration, and in the Texas case, a very divisive partisan split on abortion attitudes. I think that accounts for a lot of why Democrats were stable over the 2020 to July period, but now have dropped a lot. Republicans, on the other hand, may be recovering a little bit as they see the court making rulings that they favor more.
Mm-hmm. But the Republicans may have dropped off a little bit over that about a year ago. We think, Charles, because of the president had kind of made certain expectations of the court during the contesting of the election, and the court did not take him up on that request.
I think that's also part of this. One of the things that we see is that the views of the president have a big effect on things, and not surprisingly. It may be that Republicans, having lost the presidency as Trump leaves office, were feeling like that lowered their support for all the institutions, including the Supreme Court. I think it is also possible, but we don't have very strong evidence to say that Republicans were not satisfied with the court's decisions over this past year, moving far enough in a conservative direction. As I say, at the very end of the term, we got several sharp splits on the court between conservatives and liberals. And in these late August, early September rulings, we saw that division pretty sharply. That may bring some Republicans back in favor of the court, even as it drove Democrats and many independents to be less approving of the court.
Charles, I guess the good news for the court is it's still considered the one of the 3 branches with the highest ratings by the American public. That still is the case, correct?
It is. And while the approval numbers changed, the trust measure didn't change much at all. We ask which of the three branches of government, the Congress, the presidency, or the court, do you trust the most? And the court always ends up at the top of that rating. 58% this time say they trust the court the most, 25% the presidency, 16% Congress. But in July, before approval fell off, it was 58 for the court, 28 for the presidency, 13 for the Congress. A year ago, it was 59, 24, 16. So you see very little movement in ranking the court as most trusted, but that doesn't prevent approval of the job the court's doing from having gone down.
I got to ask you about something that I found sort of interesting in this poll, and that is that the members of the president's party, so this would have been Donald Trump over a year ago, it's Joe Biden today. If your guy was in the presidency, that was your branch that you trusted the most. I found that kind of fascinating.
Yes, I thought it was too. Right now, in this current survey, 51% of Democrats rank the presidency as the most trusted, 27% the court. And for Republicans a year ago, when Donald Trump was in office, it was 56% ranking the presidency as most trusted and 39% the court. But now, when the shoe's on the other foot, Republicans rank the presidency just 4% as the most trusted. When Democrats were looking at Donald Trump as the president, just 3% rated the presidency as most trusted. And in both of those cases, they gave the court very high ratings. So we have a sort of peculiar situation where when it's your party in the presidency, you rank that presidency high and the court second, but the other party ranks the president really low and ranks the court pretty high. And so these two things sort of balanced out between September 2020 and now, and on balance, leave us without much change in trust in the court or the presidency in total, but definitely change the groups that are ranking the presidency first and the court second, or vice versa.
One of the things we do with the Supreme Court poll is we look at public opinion about cases that have been decided and cases that are yet to be decided. And let's spend a little time on that. We'll begin with the topic of abortion, Charles. The court is going to hear arguments in a case involving a Mississippi law, I think on December 1st, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But let's begin by looking at public attitudes toward the landmark 1973 decision, the Roe versus Wade decision that established the right to abortion in this country.
Yes, this, of course, is the decision that's been one of the most controversial issues over the last 50 years. What we found is 20% would like to see the court overturn the Roe versus Wade decision. 50% would keep Roe as the right to an abortion, but 29% say they don't have an opinion. That 29% is kind of striking, as a lot of people without an opinion on this issue that's been so controversial for so long. It may be that people don't want to express an opinion about the issue, but it may also be that people really don't pay that much attention to cases by name, even a case as famous as Roe. Whatever the situation is, this result does show that half of the public, 50%, would keep the Roe decision as it stands. Only 20% would like to see that overturned.
We just mentioned the Mississippi case. We'll spend just a little bit of time on this. How did the public feel about this Mississippi law, which essentially says no abortions after 15 weeks? What did we ask people specifically, and how did they respond?
Yeah, this is a case that the court has accepted for hearing. As you say, in early December, they'll hear this case. Among other things, it does limit abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy, and that would be before the usual accepted time of fetal viability. The arguments in the case have encouraged the court to use it as a vehicle to reconsider the Roe decision and the Casey decision that also currently controls abortion policy and law. What we found here, though, is that 40% would uphold that 15-week limit, 34% would overturn it, and 27 say they don't know. That's, again, a substantial number that don't know. But in this case, a little bit of plurality, 40 to 34, would accept a 15-week ban. One of the questions that we've seen over time with abortion questions, over the last 20 or 30 years even, is that while people support the Roe decision, as we found, with a majority in favor of keeping Roe, people are much more willing to accept limitations on abortion that are short of banning abortion outright. And so here you see a case where a plurality are willing to accept a 15-week ban, even though the majority want to keep Roe in general.
Well, something that's happened since our last poll was an abortion decision. The state of Texas passed a law that would ban abortions after 6 weeks. And the Supreme Court refused to block the Texas law from going into effect. So that has happened since we were in the field last, but it happened in enough time for us to be able to poll on this question. What did we find out about that Texas law and how people feel about that wording of the language in it?
Right. The Texas law does a number of things, but the one we focused on was the so-called heartbeat law aspect of it. Other states have also passed bans once a fetal heartbeat can be detected, which occurs around 6 weeks of pregnancy, and that's built into the Texas law. Now, the Texas law does a number of other things which we did not ask about, so we focused only on this aspect of the 6-week ban. What we found here is that 30% would uphold that 6-week ban, but 46% would strike it down and 23% say they don't know. And here, compare it with the 15-week ban. With 15 weeks, it was 40 would uphold it and 34 overturn it. But with 6 weeks, it's 30 uphold it, 46 strike it down. So here you do see people more sensitive to the question of just how restrictive an abortion limitation has to be for them to be more accepting of it or less accepting of it.
Charles, there's a gun rights case, a Second Amendment case that is also before the court. This is from New York State, and I'll let you describe it, but this is essentially about people being allowed to carry a concealed weapon for defense, self-defense, outside of their home. Maybe you can fill in the gaps that I've left.
Yes, the court has, interestingly, not accepted very many gun rights cases in recent years, though they've had a number that have been considered. This one that they've now accepted involves New York State's rejection of an application for a concealed carry permit, and it challenges that permit requirement on the grounds of the Second Amendment providing a right to keep and bear arms. And the plaintiffs in this case argue that that includes a right to carry a gun outside the home that can't be prevented by these the New York requirements. So we asked whether people thought the Second Amendment should include the right to carry a gun outside the home. We did not mention specifically permits or whether it was a concealed weapon or not. 44% said that they supported that right to carry outside the home. 26% opposed that right, and 29% said they don't know.
Did people who own a gun or have a gun in their household, did they feel more strongly about this? We would suspect they might, did they?
Not only more strongly in favor, but also more opinionated about it. In homes with a gun, 60% supported a right to carry outside the home. Just 18% opposed that, 21% didn't have an opinion. But of homes without a gun, the split was about even, 33% in favor of a right to carry, 32% against. But here, 35% without an opinion. So a 14-point bump in those without an opinion for those households without a gun. We've seen this sort of thing before, of course, that folks who are most involved with guns also feel strongly about them, not just in favor of them.
Earlier this summer, Charles, there was a ruling on an Arizona law that allows greater regulation of elections. And so we asked a question that sort of builds off of that. Perhaps give us an idea of what we were looking for in this question.
Sure. So in the Arizona case that was decided on the 1st of July, the question was whether Arizona's law that put some restrictions on who can deliver absentee ballots for people, also put restrictions on preventing your vote from being counted if you voted in the wrong precinct, and some other things. The court ruled in favor of Arizona's law. And in July, when we asked about that, 23% favored that ruling, 23% opposed it, and 53% said they didn't know. And that 53% is important because we've had an awful lot of debate about election administration and the states changing their rules on elections, and the Supreme Court in recent years changing their interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. Now we ask the question, should the courts rule that states have wide authority to regulate elections in their states? Found in this survey is 26% say they should have that wide authority, 34% say they should not, and 39% say they don't know. So here's a potent issue about elections. We see quite a few people who don't have an opinion and a fairly even split, dead even in July on the specifics of the Arizona court ruling or case ruling, and now a 26-34 margin on this more general question of state regulation of elections.
What kind of partisan differences did we see, Charles?
Pretty substantial. So this does show that even though a lot of people don't know, the party lineup follows what convention would tell us. 43% of Republicans say the state should have wide authority. Just 16% would oppose that. Among Democrats, though, it's 13% saying they should have authority, 54% saying the court should rule against that authority, and a more even split with independents, 25-31.
Charles, we also asked about a case that centers on, and I want to make sure I have this right, whether states can deny public funding for students who are attending religious schools. And this is, again, a case that is before the court, that they're going to hear arguments on this. Tell us more about that case and specifically what we asked our respondents.
Right. This is a case that follows in a line of recent cases addressing this issue in various narrow degrees. This is a case from Maine in which the state provides funding for students to attend private schools, but bans the use of those monies if the private school is religious in nature. And so the question before the court is whether state laws can ban religious support for students attending religious schools if the support is otherwise generally available to all students. In this case, 34% would strike down that limitation, 15% would keep the ban on religious support, and fully 50% say they don't have an opinion about this.
There's a question on affirmative action in this survey, whether race can be used in deciding who to admit to college. What did we find?
This is a long-standing and very controversial issue where the court has, in the past, affirmed support for affirmative action. But 53% say that that should not be the case, and the court should strike down the use of race in admissions. 13% would keep it. 33% say they don't know. There's not a current case before the court but there are a number of cases in the lower courts that may turn up in the Supreme Court before too long.
Here's an interesting topic that gets a lot of attention: the regulation of social media companies. And in this case, we're talking about whether platforms like Twitter or Facebook could ban public officials from being on those platforms. What did we find here?
Yeah, this is modeled or inspired by a law in Florida, which was going to prevent social media companies from banning public figures. We didn't ask specifically about the Florida law, but the general point. 39% say they'd like the court to uphold a law that prevents social media companies from banning public officials. 26% would strike that down, and 34% say they don't know.
We had some questions about perceptions in this poll, and one of the questions deals with whether or not people feel certain groups' rights have been expanded or restricted by the courts. Tell us about what we were looking for there and some of the groups that we looked at.
Yeah, and we asked specifically over the last 15 years or so, was the way we worded the question, to try to get a sense of people's understanding of how the court has moved on a variety of issues that involve rights of certain groups in society. Constitutional scholars might argue or might agree on how the court has shifted some of the rulings in this area, but our interest was in how do the public see them? After all, the court has done a number of things in the last 15 years. How do people perceive those changes, regardless of what the legal issues and the legal doctrine may have done over time? And we see some things that I think line up with reasonable interpretation. For example, we asked about, has the court expanded or reduced the rights of LGBT people, lesbian, gay, transgender, and bisexual people over this last period? 77% say the court has expanded those rights. Just 8% think they've reduced those rights. And 15% say it hadn't changed very much either way. What about the rights of campaign donors and contributors? 39% say they've expanded those rights, 15% reduced, 46% think it hasn't changed very much either way. What about minority voters, the rights of minority voters? Here, 38% think that the court has expanded those rights, 23% reduced, and 39% not changed much in either way. This is a case where the court's recent rulings on limiting the Voting Rights Act might produce some disagreement on what direction this is taken from constitutional scholars. But from the point of view of the public, they do see more expansion rather than retraction or reduction of the rights of minority voters. What about religious people and groups, religious groups? 33% think those rights have been expanded, but 21% say reduced and 45% not changed. And this is a case where the court's rulings recently have, for the most part, expanded the court's notion of religious liberty and protection of the rights of people in religious groups. What about gun owners? We have this case pending this time. Here it's an even split. 27% think that they've expanded gun rights, 27% reduced them, 45% don't know. As I said earlier, the court actually has not issued very many rulings on gun rights recently, though a while back they did expand the right to have a gun in your home for self-defense. This case from New York that we talked about will be the major gun rights case for them to decide this term. And finally, what about the rights of people seeking an abortion? 23% think the court has expanded those rights, but 45% think they've reduced those rights, and 32% say they don't know. So that's quite a rundown of how people think the court has shifted over time. And you can see a good bit of variety. And in some cases, they line up pretty well with what we might say the court's legal doctrine has done. But in other cases, people seem to think things haven't changed or have changed when really they've not changed very much.
Another perception question, Charles. How do people perceive the justices arrive at their decisions? Is it mostly about the law? Is it mostly about politics?
And we ask these questions because of the current debate about the increased politicization of the court. How do people see what the justices are doing, largely in partisan terms or what? In this case, though, 61% say that the justices base their decisions primarily on the law. 39% say primarily politics. That's changed slightly since July, when it was 71 law, 29 politics. But a year ago, it was 62% law, 37% politics. So over the last year, not much change. The percentage saying it's the law went up just a little bit in July before coming back down this month.
Does how you identify politically make a difference when you answer that question?
Less than I think you might believe. We almost always look at partisanship and find big differences. But here, 66% of Republicans say it's primarily the law, 61% of independents, and 57% of Democrats. So there's a little bit of difference there, but it's not a large difference. And certainly compared to other partisan gaps, it's quite small.
And has that been pretty consistent over time, Charles?
It has. Republicans and independents have bounced around a little bit without any real trend, but Democrats are up 8 percentage points in saying it's mostly politics since 2019. Now, still a majority of Democrats think it's mostly the law, but there has been a rise in Democrats believing politics is part of it.
In the past, with our polling on the court, we have asked how the law should be interpreted by the justices. We give people 3 options that are often talked about when you describe how justices arrive at a decision. Lay out those 3 options we gave people and how they responded to that.
Yeah, in the legal world, we talk about textualism, original intent, and whether the law should be applied to the contemporary circumstances, the current circumstances. When we ask people not how judges do decide, but how should they decide, 32% should be reading the text as written. 20% say what the words meant when originally enacted. And 47% say the judges should decide primarily on current circumstances and how the law applies to those current circumstances.
And how did political ID affect the responses to that question?
Here we see substantial party differences. Among Republicans, 51% say the text, 21% say original meaning, and 27% say current circumstances. Democrats are flipped on that. 14% say the text, 18% say original intent, and 68% say they should interpret it based on current circumstances.
Another question we've asked before, Charles, should justices consider or ignore the views of political parties?
Here we go back to the arguments about the politicization of the court. But here, large majorities are opposed to the court's the justices explicitly thinking about party positions. 84% say they should not do that. 16% say they should. And that's over 80% no in all 3 partisan groups, Republicans, independents, and Democrats.
So they don't want, the public doesn't want us, the justices, listening to those political parties. But what about us, we the people, public opinion? Should they be considering that when they make their decisions?
More, but not so much. 59% say do not pay attention to public opinion. But here, 41% say they should consider public opinion. So it's a minority for public opinion, but a larger number. And again, a pretty substantial party split. Republicans, 74% don't consider public opinion. 25% should. But among Democrats, a pretty even split, 46% no, but a majority, 54% of Democrats say the court should attend to public opinion.
We have a question in this poll about stare decisis, or the principle of following precedent. Just how important should that be for the court? Or should the court If a majority of justices agree, say we should be willing to overturn decisions that have been made in the past. What was our question, and what did we find from the public?
This is quite a debate, and it comes up in judicial confirmations where substantially liberal senators have pushed nominees to say they would uphold past precedent because of the Roe versus Wade decision, and whether that signals that you would respect that long established precedent or not. On the other hand, we've seen conservative justices, including Justice Clarence Thomas recently, arguing that the court should not be bound by past precedent when a majority of the justices think those cases were wrongly decided. So we asked whether people thought the court should follow precedent or overturn decisions. 26% said follow precedent, and 74% said overturn if a majority think it was wrongly decided. Now, here there are partisan differences. Again, 20% of Republicans say follow precedent, 79 say overturn. Democrats, it's the opposite. 68 follow precedent, 32 don't follow. I think one part here that's going on, though, is that I'm sorry, I think I reversed those numbers on the Democratic side. It's 32 follow precedent, 68 overturn. Still more support for precedent among Democrats than among Republicans, but still minority view. I think here the word wrongly decided is a term that's used frequently in judicial debate about cases, but in common parlance, saying, should you keep a case even if it's wrongly decided? I think there's a powerful rhetorical mechanism there that says, surely you don't want to maintain a wrong case, a wrong decision. But that is the terminology that's often used in these debates among judicial scholars.
Should the court be expanded? Charles, we've asked about this on more than one occasion. Are we seeing any movement in the numbers?
Only a bit, but we do see a little bit. 48% say it should be expanded. 51 say no. Back in 2020, it was 46 to 53, and back in 2019, 42 to 56. So it's been maybe a 6-point rise in support for expansion and a 5-point decline in opposition. We are now pretty evenly divided versus in 2019, when it was a 14-point margin opposed to expansion.
And this would be another question where we see an extreme party divide, I'm assuming.
Yes. In 2019, we had a divide. About 2/3 of Republicans opposed expansion. Democrats were 50-50 then. Now it's 3/4 of Republicans opposed and not quite 3/4, 71% of Democrats in favor. So we have seen a growing division on this question by party.
What about fixed terms for justices? In other words, they would not have necessarily lifetime appointments. They would serve for a certain specified number of years, and then it would be on to the next justice. How do people feel about that?
This one's quite popular and has been when we've asked it over the years. 72% in favor of fixed terms, 27% would keep the current unlimited terms. There's a majority of each partisan group would favor fixed terms. However, here you run into a constitutional question of what would be required to make this change. It does say in the Constitution that justices are appointed for terms of good behavior.
And our final question is whether or not people favor or oppose limiting the court's ability to review acts of Congress. How do people feel about that?
Yeah, this is one of those proposals that's come up occasionally as a way to limit the court by taking this right of judicial review away from the court or limiting it. 40% would support those kinds of limits, but 60% are opposed to limiting judicial review. And that's been fairly consistent. Party views here are also majorities of each party group opposed to limiting the court's review powers.
And Charles, to wrap things up, let's return to really, I think, the news that has been made in this latest poll, and that is a fairly significant change in people's approval of the Supreme Court. I've got to ask you, as somebody who does this regularly, was that a surprising movement?
It was surprising in the sense that when you look at approval of the court over time, over the years that we've been doing these surveys, but also over longer term periods with other pollsters, approval of the court is relatively stable, certainly compared to presidential approval, which often has moved up and down somewhat dramatically over time. The court has been more stable on that. I think the contrast, though, is that here we're looking at opinion over just a 2-month period, but a 2-month period in which the court made some fairly dramatic decisions, and its latest one quite controversial on the Texas abortion law. So I think our results show that people can change their opinions of the court. And while partisanship structures that in important ways, we also see in our Marquette Law School polling since 2019 that partisans can shift in different ways and at different intervals. Republicans coming down before Democrats, while Democrats were stable. Now Republicans up slightly and Democrats down a good bit, and independents going down a good bit. So I think what the court does matters to voters, and what goes down can come back up. However, the court this term has accepted several potentially very controversial cases on abortion and gun rights, and no doubt will rule in other issues that are important to the public. Watching over the next year to see how the public's views of the court change is one of our projects, and why we're going to be doing surveys about the court every 2 months to see how these views shift over the course of this year's Supreme Court term, beginning in October.
That'll be very interesting to see where we are in September of 2022. Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Poll, great to have you with us. And we should say this poll, as I think Charles pointed out at the beginning, also asked some questions of our respondents that were unrelated to the court and related to other issues of the day. And our next poll release will be looking at those. So we're going to see a lot more of Charles here in the next 24 hours or so. So Charles Franklin, Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Poll, thank you. And thanks to all of you watching today.
Thank you.